Ezekiel 22:30, God says, I have sought for a man to stand in the gap. Now, in context, I realize he is talking about intercession. He sought for somebody to stand in the gap in intercession to pray for the land. But I want to look at an overarching principle. The reason there was a gap is because nobody was there. And so we need to look for the gaps in our generation and fill those gaps. And secondly, the gap that you see that nobody else sees is a pretty good indicator of what you're called to do. Psychologists say that our two biggest needs is identification, who am I, and purpose, why am I here? And so that we really need to answer that question. I heard a comedian say that the reason we always ask kids what they want to be when they grow up is because we're looking for ideas. But what gap you see that other people don't is a pretty good indicator of what you're called to do. And third thing about the gap is because you see it and others don't, it's easy to assume everybody sees the same gap you do, and you just want to rush in and fill the gap. Well, sometimes you have to sell people on why the gap needs to be filled to start with. Sometimes the gap inhabitants are comfortable with the gap and they don't recognize it as such. A good example is Brother Hagin. He saw a gap in his generation. God gave him the revelation of you can have, whoever can say to this mountain, be removed and be cast in the sea, and not doubt in his heart, but believe those things he says will come to pass, and he'll have whatever he say. Therefore, what those things soever you desire when you pray, believe you receive them. That was a gap in his generation. People wasn't using their faith on purpose, but that was a gap. But see, it took years of instruction to let people know why that was even a need in order to get it to them. So we can't just rush immediately to fill in the gap. Sometimes we have to sell people on the idea of filling the gap to start with. Jesus appeared to Paul and he said, I'm going to send you to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to the power of God. First of all, he had to open their eyes. He had to open their eyes to the need, and then he would be able to point to turn them from darkness to light. Because you can turn them to light, and until you've got their eyes closed, it's not going to do much good. So don't just assume everybody else sees the same gap you do, and find the gap, and that's where you're going to prosper, and that's where you're going to be successful, because God is showing you a gap in your generation.